Welcome back, and thanks again for listening to the Windsor Report. You know, there's doing the right things, and then there's doing the right things right. Ohio Secretary LaRose announced yesterday that non-citizens who twice self-attest to not being a U.S. citizen should be removed from voter rolls by local elections boards. Lots of applause was accompanied by that announcement. We published the story at the Ohio Press Network. And then I thought, wait a minute, shouldn't non-citizens be identified before being put on voter rolls and not authorized to register to vote to begin with? That's the question you can answer right now on X at Jack Windsor or the show account at Windsor Report. To discuss it a lot more in depth, I'm going to welcome back to the show Marcell Strbich, one of Ohio's leading constituent election integrity advocates and a contributor to provisions within the election bill being put forth in the Ohio State House that I know that we're going to talk about now. Marcell, welcome back. How are you on this Thursday?
I'm doing great here. Thanks, Jack. Good to be back. A lot to discuss.
Yes. So let me open with you by asking the question that our listeners are going to vote on, and that is Secretary LaRose made the announcement yesterday that these non-citizens will be taken off the rolls after they twice self-declare that they're not citizens by their local boards of elections. Shouldn't we be dealing with this before they go on the voter rolls?
Yes, absolutely. It was a good step, and in some respect, it allows the conversation to now take place nationally. So he certainly set the tone with that. But there's going to still be a number of issues here going forward because the annual audit, which was performed and revealed 137 registered non-citizens, number one, confirms that they're getting on. So now we have to go back to how does that happen? And it happens, quite frankly, based on the limitation that the County Board of Elections have in getting access to that authoritative data. And it happens in part because we do not yet have the validation that HB-472 is calling upon. And so when we look at this issue, meaningful numbers of non-citizens do register to vote, and there's a good study that's been put forward nationally by the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies and shows that 27% of non-citizens have gone forward and claim to have registered to vote, and up to 13% have actually cast a ballot. That was back in 2008. And so that's reflective of the challenge that we have today.
Okay, I want to make sure that I highlight that again. Based on what you just told me, the Cooperative Congressional Election Study said 27% of non-citizens have gone forward and registered to vote. 13% have actually cast a ballot. That's going back to 2008, 2010. Let's fast forward. Anybody, unless you've been hiding under a rock, knows that there have been millions more pouring into our country. We're talking about big numbers. Give us some big picture, zoom out, big picture perspective on what we might be looking at. Because one of the things we hear is, oh my gosh, the Republicans, these people who want to disenfranchise voters, they're worried about these small numbers. These are big numbers, aren't they, Marcel?
They're absolutely big numbers, and it's very difficult to get reliable data. When you look at the way that we screen for them today, we're really restricted by Ohio law. We have a law, 3503.152, and the Secretary of State follows that law, as he's pointed out. But it applies a overly restricted standard for the Secretary of State. When he does his annual audit, he looks back and it tries to assess what he's identified through the support he gets from the Board of Motor Vehicles, which houses that data. And so the criteria that's set for him to even screen right now is so improbable. It requires a non-citizen to essentially voluntarily undertake a series of improbable steps. They come into the Board of Motor Vehicles, they have to submit documentation. Then for the second part of that, they have to register to vote, and then they have to submit like a name of an address change or vote. And then lastly, they have to come back, and this is really the most problematic part, why I think in part the number may be so low in terms of what gets revealed. They have to come back voluntarily for a second time to the Board of Motor Vehicles to submit a documentation. Now, what would compel them, Jack, to actually come back a second time? They've got their identifications. What is their incentive to do that? I can't really fathom it other than the law was written to be very restrictive and perhaps limit the criteria for the screening. And so what if that second documentation submission was removed? Could it be possible that there's actually thousands And so that's something that's the question that needs to be posed.
Yeah. So that to me is terrifying. 137, and you go, okay, because I guarantee the argument that's going to happen in the press is, well, 137, how many elections were decided by 137? That's what we know. That number could be massive. So I'm going to throw some things out here, and maybe this is in the wrong sequence, so correct me and make sure we get back on the right course. But I'm thinking about Bureau of Motor Vehicles. I traced that back to, I think it was like the motor voter law or something, that if somebody is at the BMV, they're required to get an application to vote. Many people who are non-citizens, I would think probably out of compliance, desire to do things right, fill everything out, not really sure, and so they can maybe get on the voter rolls that way. And then, by the way, I want to talk about this, and maybe we don't hit it right now, but Help Americans Vote Act, HAVA, doesn't that tie federal funding to the girth and size of the voter rolls in each state? So aren't states incented to have larger voter rolls in order to get more federal money?
Yeah, federal law is often conflicted and made things difficult for election administrators. On the one hand, they have a statutory duty to ensure the voter roll accuracy, and that needs to be that there is no invalid or expired records per se, or corrected records. Well, we see perennially about 10% of issues or adjudication or questionable records at any given point in time. So when we do a national change of address, and that happens on an annual basis, a number of these invalid, let's say voter records that are plus 6 years, they get removed, and in pretty quick order, they get brought back up. So that really addresses the fact that there's a systemic issue there. And then, yes, federal grant money often, and if you look at just the size of the population, the distribution from 2022, and the Election Assistance Commission does produce this data, so it supports in large part, it shows that the states with more population, of course, more voter registration, tend to do better. So where do you draw the line between completely getting your records clean and then doing so realizing that you're also going to create other conditions? So
there's a lot going on here, and I want to bring it back to one simple idea, and then we'll talk more about, I believe it's House Bill 472. Did I get that correct? Is it 472? Correct. So we're talking about non-citizens being taken off the rolls, and the argument is, well, why aren't we catching them before they get on the voter rolls? What is the solution, Marcel?
The solution and what needs to be done in part, because from May to November, there's no more audits set by law. But there is the ability, and there is no restriction per se on our chief election officials to actually conduct more frequent checks. The Board of Motor Vehicles does an excellent job of compiling the information of applicants that are non-citizens, and they are required to process and send that to the Secretary of State. So a couple aspects that we can do to protect the ballot in 2024 is a security directive can go forward to the County Board of Elections. A monthly check can take place off of the Board of Motor Vehicles non-citizen list. And what's revealed on that list can be cross-checked off of our statewide voter registration database. And those applications that are non-citizens can be flagged, and it can be placed in a status called provisional, which is an eligibility criteria in essence, in which they would be limited to only voting in person. And so that takes the mail-in absentee ballot off the table, because that is not a photo ID check in part, and they cannot vote by our state law by mail-in ballot if they're in provisional status. And that means that somebody who is that intent on voting, or somebody, let's say, who would intend to vote on somebody else's behalf, would have to go into a polling place, present where it is a more restrictive environment, a photo ID, and then a poll worker has a chance, based on our new law from last year, to see if it says citizen or non-citizen, if it's been issued after April or May of 2023, or it says non-renewable, non-transferable. And poll workers have to be trained and ready to look for that. Feedback in the past is many of them, in an inconsistent way, applied an understanding that. I think that will improve the longer and the more mature this procedure goes. But if you think about it, with 236,000 state IDs and driver's licenses issued to non-citizens, many of those were issued without those identifiers currently on them.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, Marcel. We've got to cut you real quick right there, and we'll finish this up on the other side. welcome back. Final segment. Joined by Marcell Strbich, one of Ohio's leading constituent election integrity advocates and, of course, contributor to provisions of a very important election bill being considered in the Ohio State House. Marcell, I want to let you finish the point that you were making before we went to break.
Yeah, absolutely. I was drawing upon the distinction of a non-citizen being able to use a photo ID that they obtained through the Board of Motor Vehicles, and the recommendation, the interim solution, could be for identifying non-citizen applicants through the Board of Motor Vehicles through more frequent checks by the Secretary of State, which is under his authority. He can go to do that in the lead up from May to November to cover this gap period, because his annual audit will not occur until 2025 again by law. And so whomsoever he identifies, he can also put them in a provisional status, which will restrict anybody in a non-citizen application to voting in person only, not able to vote by mail and absentee ballot. That would be a tangible step that can be taken in the lead up, because realistically, 90 days before an election, you cannot remove records. That means on August 7th, that is the cutoff point for the Secretary of State. And so the Secretary of State is trying to balance, of course, the restrictions imposed upon him by federal law, and now we have this law in Ohio overly restricted for screening that he has to also account for. And so nothing restricts him, though, from taking tangible steps and characterizing anybody he identifies from now until November in provisional status. And that would be a big step toward signaling something very substantive and demonstrating that he is that leader, of course, that is in the state amongst SOSs that would be preventing that non-citizen from being able to cast a ballot in 24.
And what you're saying resonates with me, because I talk about polls a lot, and one of the things that people say to me is, you got to be careful being too far away from the election, because a lot of people don't really tune in until it gets closer. Well, likewise, a lot of organizations don't start their get out to vote and voter registration drives until closer to the election. So really that time you're talking about, May to November, or in this case, 90 days prior to the November election. So this would require then that non-citizens be put on a provisional ballot list, and that they're checking with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles monthly. Is that what part of House Bill 472 does? And where does somebody like Secretary Frank LaRose stand on that, what I call no-brainer solution to a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So it does do that. HB 472 does require more frequent checks, not just for non-citizens, but for records that are in error or in adjudication up to weekly at some point. So the whole premise of 472 is let's do the work up front. And where he has stood on this is he has been supportive when giving interviews and discussing this. He has said, as recently as of yesterday, certainly he has a favorable view of being able to do a more frequent check of this from our understanding, and we think he can follow through on it. I think some of the pushback comes from some of the election administrative side that sees something like this and say, well, that's an undue burden. And I think my answer to that is the undue burden is currently in place, because when we maintain, let's say, 700,000 voter records that have been there for over 6 years, that results in the creation of up to 700 precincts that you wouldn't have to create. Those are jurisdictions that now require overhead, election equipment, polling sites. How much does that cost? And what type of an election burden does that include when you have to find election volunteers and expand your whole election operations on the back end? So where is the undue burden? The undue burden is on the back end when we don't properly maintain the accuracy and keep the voter records down to what they should be. And so that is one way to look at this, is where do you want to place that? Do it on the front end, or do you want to spend the millions that come on the back end because you're having to account for voter records that really aren't voting, but you haven't removed yet?
Yeah, and I'll put it in my terms, measure twice, cut once, or if you want to talk about it from a medical perspective, preventive health is a lot better than sick care. There's something to say about doing it up front the right way to avoid a litany of challenges on the back end. What do we do from here? I mean, right now, Secretary LaRose is taking a victory lap, and kudos to him for at least pointing to the fact that some people did get onto the rolls and they need to be taken off. But where do we go from here? This is a bigger problem than I think many people are giving it credit for. About 3 minutes here, Marcel. So what do we do?
Well, first and foremost, we coalesce around the idea of citizenship identity verification in the year 2024. This is an election year. People are paying attention. We have the HB-472 bill. We need that proponent testimony. We could be, as soon as next week, doing it. We are in the Homeland Security Committee. We also need to draw on key senators to recognize the moment. And we need to support the Secretary of State, who has pointed out in a valid way that both federally and from a state perspective, he has bounds. And so the legislature coming through can set the tone, can remove that restrictive screening threshold, which may certainly reveal a far greater problem. And then we can act upon that through more frequent checks, changes in that eligibility status administratively, and at least going into 2024's federal election, we'll be in a position to tamp down the likelihood of that mail-in absentee ballot vote that could potentially appear. And then the Secretary of State can certainly make the case to his fellow Secretary of States that this is the way Ohio is dealing with the circumstances. And then ideally, there is the SAVE Act that comes into play at a federal level, which will grant the access to the databases that the Secretary of State is asking for now, and will also ensure that the citizenship records are verifiability is done up front before there's even an offer on the table for somebody as a non-citizen to register.
So when you say, quickly here, we have about a minute, when you say the SAVE Act and at the federal level access to a database, tell us just a little bit more about that. I want to make sure I have clarity on it.
So HB-472 put a provision, and Secretary of State came out in his announcement that he wants access to the SAVE database. It's an eligibility database that reveals non-citizens. It doesn't cover all non-citizens, but the Department of Homeland Security does have a pretty wide listing of non-citizens that register for benefits. And what has to happen is a law has to be passed at the state level, and at that point, the other states that have gone this path are able to gain access to it from the federal side. And so we need to start going down that path, but we need that legislation to support it. Then the Secretary of State can have a memorandum of agreement, and then our Board of Motor Vehicles can issue the identifier numbers that are needed. These checks can all be done, again, through advanced data validation, which is the basis upon which 472 is built, because we see the systemic issues over and over again on how we can't seem to get a certain portion of those voter records out of errors or in a valid status, about 10% on a perennial basis. And we are trying to work on that aspect from the election administration side to support the election administrators and the Secretary of State.
Marcell Strbich, one of Ohio's leading constituent election integrity advocates and contributor to House Bill 472. I know we're going to have you back because there's a lot to talk about. Thanks for spending time with us today on the Windsor Report. Marcel, we deeply appreciate all of your wisdom.
Thanks. Great to be with you, and appreciate you highlighting the importance of this issue.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Windsor Report. Make sure to set an alarm, 5 o'clock tomorrow. Tell a friend. Be back here. See you then.